I will give folks probably until 1 minute after or so too. All right, welcome to everyone joining us. I'm just going to give folks 1 minute and then we'll get started. Brad, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? So that's up, and then I'll just introduce us in a second. Okay, well, I guess I will kick us off. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm Abby Wozniak, and I'm going to be chairing this session. I want to acknowledge Kevin Rinz's hard work actually organizing it, but I'm excited to be able to host today. We have 4 great papers, and we have 2 discussants. So if folks haven't been in this format before, we're going to have 2 papers followed by 1 discussion of both of them, and that will happen twice. So we're going to get started in just a second with Brad Hershbein, who will be talking about the response of the social safety net to recessions. We're excited about all the papers we have on why and how do local labor markets differ. I hope that folks will feel free to engage in asking questions in the Q&A. That's where attendees can ask questions. And we have a good number of co-authors as well as some availability while other authors are presenting. So we discussed with the whole panel in advance that folks will go in and try to answer your questions when they are done presenting, if they don't have a chance to answer them in person. So please feel free to put those questions in there. I will pull out ones when we have discussion time if I need to do that. But hopefully you'll get your question answered from at least most of the authors as they have a chance to go through after they're done presenting their own paper. Okay, so I will turn it over now to Brad. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Abby. I'm really happy to present this joint work with my colleague and co-author, Bryan Stuart, who's also on the presentation on the call. As Abby said, it's about the response of the social safety net to recessions. And so recessions have been covered in the literature tremendously. It's a very well researched subject, but most of the work that's been done has been focused on the short run, often at a national level, typically focused on the business cycle, national outcomes. There's a lot less evidence, relatively, I should say, on local labor markets, the impact of what's going on across states, across metro areas or commuting zones. There's still an amount, but considerably less than on the national attention. And we should care about this because it affects labor market dynamism, the economic opportunity, where people end up. Raj Chetty and co-authors have demonstrated that where you grow up has tremendous implications for your economic opportunity later in life. There's been slowing regional economic convergence from some of Peter Ganong's work with Denny Shoag, but also the reallocation of jobs across space, the fact that coastal cities have been doing really well, more interior places in the United States have not been doing as well. All of this could be related to the effect of recessions on local labor markets. But it's also relevant because it calls into question the adequacy of the social safety net, which is generally very geared towards being cyclical, responding when economic conditions get worse, and then generally dying down when economic conditions in the aggregate improve. But if there are longstanding differences across places that recessions cause, there may be needs for more structural responses and not just cyclical responses. And so this research that we've been doing it's a series of papers, and this is going to be the second one. But we're focusing on the five most recent recessions, excepting the current one. We will be studying that one later on when there is data to do so. So the one in the mid-70s, the early 80s, the early 90s, the early 2000s, and the Great Recession. And we're basically going to be looking at the severity of the recession across metro areas, about 360 of them throughout the country. These sharp employment changes around the time of the recession, which vary in magnitude. How does that play out in terms of the economic outcomes we're interested in? And we are going to be careful to control for other factors that are affecting local economic activity to isolate the effect of the job loss itself rather than pre-existing or secular trends. And so in the first paper, which I think a few people may have seen, we find that each of these five recessions has led to a persistent relative decline, not only in employment and population, but in employment rates, the employment population ratio, as well as earnings per capita. There is a divergence across places over time that recessions seem to be causing. In this paper, we're going to be focusing on the social safety net transfers, which are overwhelmingly government transfers. And we're going to find that they also persistently increase, but by a relatively small amount. And so that they only end up compensating for somewhere between 10% and 30% of the overall earnings losses. And as a result, there is a rise in both poverty rates and inequality, again, relative to other areas that were not as badly affected by the recession. And so just a quick review of the literature. It's huge. We're barely scratching the surface here. There's more in the paper. There's big literature on the demand to shocks on local labor markets. It's relatively small compared to recessions overall, but it's still relatively large. And most of it is focusing on unemployment. How rapidly does that recover? Maybe in some cases earnings. You can see there's a bunch of papers there. There's a separate literature on the safety net response to local economic conditions, a bigger one for national economic conditions. This literature also has some features about focusing on which groups are disproportionately hurt during recessions. Particularly, they tend to be disadvantaged groups. But often it's very narrowly focused on a specific program like disability insurance or SNAP. And the horizons that tend to be focused on tend to be pretty short as well, often during the trough, maybe a year into recovery. We're going to be a little bit different, but I want to say that there are a few recent exceptions, including Regina, who's studying the response of the social safety net after hurricanes and other natural disasters, broadly speaking, and finding that there is persistence there too, as well as a more recent paper by East and Simon that just came out a couple months ago, looking at the effects of the social safety net after job loss, individual job loss. We're going to be different from some of these papers by focusing on longer term effects up to a decade out on places for five most recent recessions. So we're really looking at it not just the most recent, the Great Recession, but has this been changing over time? Is it a consistent, persistent phenomenon, or is it evolved more recently? And we're also going to be looking at transfer programs that we don't necessarily think of as means tested. So things like retirement, Medicare, Medicaid as well, and it turns out that those are going to be important. And so we measure recession severity using the change in an MSA's employment from peak to trough, the national timing of peak to trough. We're using Bureau of Economic Analysis data and consistent geographic definitions over time. There are other ways we could proxy this. We've used several, including shift share measurements, other sorts of, some people have used like VAR residuals. It doesn't seem to matter that much in terms of the qualitative findings that we have, but this is our preferred measure because we think it's easier and transparent. We talk a little bit more about why we think that in the paper. The identification is that The recession severity varies considerably across metro areas, and it's not always the same metro areas that are hit in each recession. Even though we think that recessions are driven by cyclical industries, and that's true, it's often manufacturing and construction, there's still a lot of residual variation across places. And to illustrate that, here's just a map showing these are the areas, the number of areas, the areas that suffered, the number of times they suffered a severe recession above the median in terms of the employment loss across the most recent 5. Yes, the industrial heartland gets hit a lot, but there are still a lot of variation. Some areas don't manage to get by relatively unscathed. Some people, some areas are much more badly hit. And so another way to think about that is just here is a kernel density graph across the 5 recessions, each one showing across all the metro areas where the employment change is coming. We're doing annual changes. So in some cases, there are plenty of metro areas that actually still manage to gain in employment over the recession. They're just gaining less than they otherwise would have. But we're really identifying off of the cross-sectional variation, and that's something to keep in mind. So when we actually try to estimate the impacts, we're basically going to be running event study regressions separately for each recession. And so the key parameter is going to be this delta T, the effect of the recession on the outcome for each time period, both with lags before the recession begins to check for pre-trending, as well as going forward up to 10 years. We're going to do several levels of controls, including division by year fixed effects. So we're identifying off of MSA shocks or employment changes within the division year, as well as for each MSA, the pre-recession population growth by age group for interacted with every year. So that's really trying to control for secular changes in population dynamics that are going ahead of time. And then instead of running a fixed effects, we're going to control for the lag dependent variable. And we discuss in the paper why we think that that's a better idea. And so everything is going to be normalized to 3 years before the peak, just so you can see how things evolve. And I want to emphasize that we are looking at relative impacts. It's not an absolute impact, it's relative to what would have happened to a less severely affected area. And so the outcomes we're going to look at here are real earnings per capita. We want to do that again because it sets the stage for how important the transfers are in making up the earnings loss. With a little bit of distributional earnings, we can supplement the BEA data with data from Census and ACS. Instead of using an event study, looking at a long difference to see which groups are more affected. But then we're really going to focus on the detailed information on transfers per capita that are available in the BEA data. And then we're going to do some decompositions for each type. Which types of transfers are responding both in the short term and over time. And some of the ones that we're able to look at include retirement and disability. We can't separate those in the BEA data, but we can in Social Security data. And so there's a little bit of that we're able to separate. Medical, which is mostly Medicare and Medicaid. The typical income maintenance programs that we think of as a social safety net, the EITC, SNAP, SSI, things like that. UI is a big one. And then we go back to look at an overall measure of income per capita, which is saying that income is earnings plus transfers. If that's still falling, then transfers by construction are not making up the loss in earnings. And so I'm basically going to present a bunch of event study graphs. They should go through relatively quickly. You're going to see that they look pretty similar, and there's going to be a recurring pattern. So we start with the log earnings per capita. And so this graph right here is showing what happens when there is an employment shock in the early 70s recession. The y-axis can be interpreted as an elasticity for a percent change in the employment. What is the change in log earnings per capita in percentage terms for each year afterwards? The preferred specification, we run this a bunch of different ways, is going to be the blue line. That is capturing the controls that I talked about before, the division by year fixed effects and the population changes, the secular population changes interacted by year. You can see in this case, it doesn't matter much. There's a sharp drop so that the elasticity is around about negative two thirds at trough. It kind of recovers a little bit as flat and then begins to recover near the 80s, but we've actually carried this forward even longer, all the way up to 2017, and it comes back down again. And we can still reject that the earnings have recovered at the end of the horizon. And this is actually one of the more sanguine examples. This is what happens if we go to the early 80s. The green specification here, we're now controlling for the prior recession shock interacted with each subsequent year as well. You can see that that doesn't make much of a difference either. There is a hysteresis here as well. Here it is for the early 90s recession. Here it is for the early 2000s recession. and then here it is for the Great Recession. So in each case, there is a large decline in earnings per capita at trough, which is not to be that surprising, but the recovery is relatively weak, if at all. Here, there's some recovery towards the Great Recession, but again, even 8 years after trough, the recovery has been only half what the maximum trough was. And so we can summarize this just numerically, looking at the long-term elasticities. This is basically summarizing what I said. The long-term elasticities are somewhere between negative 1.4 to negative 1.2 for the early 2000s recession. If you want to think of that in terms of a standard deviation shock, it's on the order of, for an additional standard deviation of employment loss, correlates to somewhere between a 2 to 4% decline in relative earnings per capita, even 7 to 9 years after recession trough. That's a pretty big effect. We can also look at the distributional earnings impacts. These are the long differences I was talking about before, where we can replicate using mean. I should be very careful, a little bit careful. Here we're looking at the mean log earnings, not the log of the mean, which is what the BEA data is. But at this scale, it doesn't matter that much. We can generally replicate the findings that we found in BEA with census and ACS data, but we also are able to look at percentile distributions, conditional on them being positive. And you can see that there are effects throughout the earnings distribution, but they tend to be stronger, more severe, lower in the earnings distribution, and that should not be much of a surprise to anyone who's worked in this literature. So there are hysteresis effects on earnings. They are more concentrated and lower in the earnings distribution. So how do transfers actually respond given that we've seen these earnings losses? And so here's what we look at. These are total transfers, log real transfers per capita across everything that BEA is capturing, which is pretty broad, as I indicated before when I went through some of the examples. They rise very substantially right away. That's good. Social safety is responding. You would expect that. However, you might think that they come back down as the economy, the economic conditions recover, but we find out that that's not actually the case. So here in the early 70s or mid-70s recession, the initial elasticity at trough is around 3/4. It comes down a little bit, but even by the end of the period, it's still a half, and we can reject 0 easily 10 years later. Here it is for the early 80s recession. The recovery is very gradual. Again, we can reject that it's recovered. Here, the early 90s recession, there's basically no recovery at all. Transfers rise, they stay elevated the entire time period. Here it is for the early 2000s, same story. And here it is for the Great Recession, very slight recovery. So there's persistent increase in the relative rate of transfers per capita, even as these regional economies are recovering, transfers are staying elevated relative to less severely affected places. And if we look at that in a summary, the long-term elasticities are on the order of about a half, in some cases a little bit less, in other cases a little bit higher. That's pretty big. The standard deviation terms, again, it's around 2 to 4%. It's a little bit lower in the more recent recessions than it was earlier on. So in some cases, the social safety net in terms of targeting, how much of a response it is, it's responding towards areas that were more severely affected to less severely affected, it's gotten a little bit weaker over time compared to earlier. And we want to delve a little bit more into like what the impacts of the 96 welfare reform did, but it doesn't seem to be doing that much, at least in terms of the overall transfers measure. That may not be surprising because overall transfers are dominated by things like Medicare, Medicaid, and OASDI, which welfare reform really didn't affect. We can also look at this and decomposing it by the type of transfer. So the black line is basically showing you the overall replacement rate. If we divide the transfers coefficients by the earnings loss coefficients and taking out the sign, how much of earnings are actually being made up by the transfers. That rises over time because the earnings are gradually recovering faster than the transfers. So the transfers are making up more of an impact over time, even though in an absolute scale it's less. And you can see that, and for the early 70s recession, the UI, which is in orange, responds considerably right away, but then fades out. The big ones are the blue circles and the red squares. Those are respectively OASDI, retirement and disability, and Medicare and Medicaid. They rise more in terms of the overall replacement rates and then get very big over time. It's big dollars that we're talking about for these programs, even though their own responses in terms of elasticities aren't as large or considerably larger than the others. It's just a much bigger program. So in terms of replacement rate, it matters a lot more. The things that we think of as traditional social safety net responses, the income maintenance, the green triangles, it does respond and it stays elevated over time. It's just in dollar terms much, much smaller. And so you don't see it as elevated. If we go through the other recessions, the patterns are pretty similar. Retirement and medical, again, are a big component of the overall rise in transfer rates over time. Income maintenance is third, but it's just smaller in dollars. We do show in the appendix of the paper that there is a huge response to the income maintenance programs. There is a high elasticity, particularly in food stamps or SNAP. Again, because the dollar terms are really low. Here, the early 90s recession, was a relatively mild recession, so replacement rates were small. Again, retirement for the early 2000s recession, and in the Great Recession, Medicare and Medicaid are particularly driving it. In the paper, we also show a decomposition of how much of this is OAS versus DI for the retirement. It's about equal, it turns out, using the SSA data. And so we can summarize that again. I'm just almost out of time because I want to get to the summary of what this portends for income. We've seen that the overall replacement rates, those black lines that I just showed you really quickly, were between 10 and 30% of the overall earnings loss. So as a consequence, we know that income is not being made up for entirely. And that shows here in terms of the long-term elasticities on income per capita, which range from about -0.3 to -0.8, depending on the recession. Again, we're finding somewhere around 1.5 to 3% per standard deviation shock difference in the long term. So an area that received a 1 standard deviation rate or shock, even when you account for the long-term transfers flows, they're still suffering a 1.5 to 3% relative decline in income per capita to a less affected area. And as a result, based on the nature of the transfers, which are heavily geared towards retirement, disability to some extent, Medicare and Medicaid, with the exception of Medicaid, most of those are not very income targeted. Disability is a little bit, but not the income maintenance ones. The ones that are very income targeted are relatively small dollars and small potatoes. As a result, we're actually seeing an increase in long-term increase in relative poverty rates for the, especially for the early 80s and the latter two recessions. That is staying elevated relative to areas that were less affected, again, even as the aggregate economy in each of those areas recovers. And so to kind of wrap up, we find that locally worse recessions are leading to persistent declines in relative per capita earnings. The losses are concentrated at the bottom. And I didn't get a chance to go into this much, but they're not driven by demographic changes. We go into that in the companion paper. We can, again, use the census and ACS data to residualize on a whole bunch of demographic factors, which are changing, by the way. We do find that areas that get hit more severely by recessions are getting older. That ends up driving quite a bit of the overall transfers, but not the decline in per capita earnings. The government transfers do rise, and the takeaway is that they stay elevated almost in all cases. The one exception is UI. That one is cyclical. It's designed to be cyclical, so that's not a surprise. But old age survivors, disability insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, they all stay elevated, and those are big dollar programs. OAS is 600, where we have $400, $500 billion a year, more I think at this point. Medicare and Medicaid are almost the same size at this point. They're all really big dollar programs. Together, they're many times the size of the social safety net of the income maintenance programs. The majority of the Medicare and OASDI are actually caused by shifts in the age structure, but it's just over half. So it's even the age structure is explaining a lot of it, but not all of it. There's still other impacts that we're trying to investigate and try to better understand why there are long-term increases in these programs. The income maintenance programs do respond in the short term. I mentioned that SNAP is especially responsive. The short term and even medium term elasticity is greater than 1, but they're much smaller in aggregate dollars. And so as a result, transfers make up on roughly about 1/6 of the earnings losses. And so one of the major takeaways is that the social safety net is both less cyclical, but also broader than we are used to thinking. It is longer, there are structural changes, but many more programs besides income maintenance matter. And so the policy focus on temporary aid isn't really enough. We need to think about longer term additional investments to help areas recover in addition to just giving them short-term money. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Brad. That was great. We are going to go right now next to Kevin Rinz, and then that will be followed by Peter Ganong's discussion of both papers. I do want to just encourage folks who are in the audience to submit questions or comments through the Q&A. I know that audience members can't always see who is here, but we have a fantastic audience, and I know that you are all capable of submitting outstanding comments and questions. So please feel free to chime in there. Again, authors will try to get in and answer that and at least take a look. So I know it'd be really valuable for them to hear from you. So please use Q&A for that. Okay, now Kevin is up. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. This is going to be joint work with my census colleague, John Voorheis. These views on a regional income convergence through a distributional perspective are ours and not those of anyone else at the Census Bureau. And to kind of echo what Abby was just saying, this work is at a stage where any kind of comments, questions, suggestions you might have will be especially valuable to us. This is earlier work than I often get a chance to present, so I'm excited to see what you guys think of it. So just to kind of get right into it then, if we kind of step back in time 70 or so years, it used to be the case that on average income at the state level grew faster in states that had lower levels of income. So what you can kind of see here on this chart from the downward slope of the regression line is higher rates of average income growth over the following 20 years for states that had lower levels of income in 1950. If we kind of step forward in time then to 1995, we can see that that's kind of no longer true, really. The regression line in the orange portion of the scatter plot is pretty flat. The rate of growth over the 20 years from 95 to 2015 had very little relationship to the level of income a state had in 1995. That kind of shift was a gradual one. It's not, I didn't pick out unusual years. This line here shows the slopes of these types of scatter plots for 20-year horizons starting at each year shown, and they kind of gradually get flatter, suggesting in one interpretation kind of declining regional income convergence. Convergence comes from that negative slope with faster growth at lower incomes, and over time, as that slope gets flatter, one way to think about that change is that kind of state incomes are no longer converging, and that's something Peter showed in some previous work and found an important role for changes in migration of high and low wage workers in combination with some changes in housing costs associated with the kind of land use restrictions. But a couple things we want to think about in this work are two big types of questions. One is kind of to what extent does this thinking about the relationship between levels and growth of income capture convergence? Slower growth from a higher level could still produce an increasing absolute gap in incomes between places. Though admittedly it's kind of clearer what's happening once the kind of slope of that regression line switches signs. But the other one that I think we're going to spend most of our time on today is thinking about whose experience does this type of analysis capture. Are incomes converging similarly or differently for people who reside in different portions of the income distribution, or do demographic groups have differential experiences of convergence over time? And then kind of a bit more broadly, do comparisons of mean incomes make sense for assessing regional convergence in a time of high and increasing income inequality? So today, we're going to kind of re-examine regional income convergence a little bit in light of these kind of questions. The work so far does kind of two things. First, we use some alternative measures of convergence to assess recent trends. And for the most part, we find that you come to the same kind of conclusion about how convergence has changed over the last few decades, whether you use this kind of measures along the lines of the scatter plots I've already shown you, or some different types of measures that we can construct from the data we have. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this today because the answer is we already knew the answer. The thing we're instead going to focus on is using some tax data we have access to at Census to consider whether or why different portions of the income distribution or different demographic groups have seen incomes converge or diverge differentially across states over the last 2 decades. And when we do this, what we're going to find is that state incomes have diverged at the top of the income distribution while continuing to converge at and below kind of upper middle incomes. We also find that top divergence is driven largely by white and Asian incomes, while Black and Hispanic incomes have continued to converge throughout the distribution. And this is going to be the portion of the work that we focus on here today. So in a short talk like this, I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about the data, except to say that it's great. We're working with the universe of tax returns merged with some demographic information collected from surveys. The income concept we're going to use is the familiar adjusted gross income. We can kind of talk more later about how we might want to modify that, or what things would look like if we had a chance to incorporate some of the kind of safety net stuff Brad was just talking about. But for now, we're going to focus on AGI. And when we do that, just kind of as a baseline, I want to show you this chart, which kind of reproduces that kind of growth versus levels income scatter for the period covered by our data, which at the moment run from 1998 through 2017. And what we take away from this is that changing this income concept from per capita personal income or whatever else you might use in kind of public surveys to the tax-based AGI measure doesn't really change our kind of baseline understanding of how incomes have converged or not across states recently. The regression line here is again pretty flat. If anything, slightly positively sloped, suggesting a bit of divergence with higher income states potentially growing a bit faster over these 19 or so years than lower income states. That kind of mean level analysis does mask some important heterogeneity across the distribution. This figure kind of produces that same type of scatter plot, measuring average annual growth on the y-axis against level of income in the base year 1998 on the x-axis. But now it shows that for several key percentiles of the income distribution, and what we see here is that at lower percentiles of the distribution, incomes kind of are continuing to converge with faster growth at lower levels. But as you move up the distribution into the 90th percentile, and especially once you get to the top percentile of the distribution, we see faster growth in states that initially had higher levels of income at those percentiles. So top incomes seem to be diverging while lower and middle incomes continue to converge. This chart shows just kind of the kind of slopes of these regression lines, but for every percentile. So again, this isn't kind of these scatter plots are not unusual in the distribution. Here we see kind of some kind of maybe sharper convergence at the very low percentiles, which I don't know, the bottom of the AGI distribution is always a little weird, so I wouldn't put a huge amount of stock in that. But throughout the kind of lower middle income distribution, the rate of convergence is fairly stable. At the top of the distribution, and as in particular above about the 85th percentile, we see incomes are kind of increasingly diverging across states. when we break this out by race, we see, perhaps not surprisingly, given their share of the population, that convergence and divergence patterns for white incomes look very similar to the overall distribution, with top incomes diverging and lower incomes, in this case, fairly close to kind of neither converging nor diverging. Asian incomes similarly diverge at the top, though show somewhat stronger convergence in the middle and bottom. Getting into Black and Hispanic incomes, though, is where we see a more stark difference. Black incomes are continuing to converge over this period throughout the distribution. And that's that's true in the top percentile, despite the fact that values of the top percentile of Black incomes fall in a range of white and Asian incomes in which we see divergence across states. So it's not just that that Black and Hispanic incomes are lower than white and Asian incomes, and so are behaving as you would expect given their position in the overall distribution. Black and Hispanic incomes are continue to converge throughout the distribution over this period, despite divergence in white and Asian incomes at the top. This is kind of ties back a little bit to kind of a macro story about the last few decades, and also to our and how we think about what we get from mean measures of income divergence. This is just kind of a picture that shows growth over this period, 98 to 17, by percentile of the AGI distribution. And what we see here is that, as you are probably familiar with from popular discussion and prior research, most of the growth in incomes over this period is occurring at the top of the distribution. So kind of here we see from roughly the 10th percentile to the 70th or 80th percentile, average annual growth would be close, would be fairly flat over this period, while the kind of real growth we see shows up at the top of the distribution. And so why is it that mean measures of income divergence don't tell this full distributional story that we've seen in these previous figures? Well, it's because the incomes are diverging at the top, where incomes are growing more, while the converging portion of the distribution is experiencing lower growth overall. So kind of pulling that all together into a mean measure shows roughly flat convergence, while in kind of when you get into the distributional questions more, you see that you are actually that masks kind of importantly different experiences of different portions of the income distribution. So I want to say a little bit more about the data at this point. Having access to these kind of large tax data sets gives us, offers some potential for kind of more direct measures of regional income distributions and similarity between income distributions. Having the universe of records allows for better measurement of the full distribution at smaller geographies, states, and potentially even local geographies moving forward. We can use these kind of well-measured distributions to create measures of similarity and analyze how the distributions and the similarity between them change over time. And these kind of measures may kind of conceptually align more closely with convergence and divergence concepts than just the kind of scatter plot based analysis we've talked about so far. What we've done to this point is kind of create a couple what we're calling regional income divergence curves to give us a way of depicting local income distributions relative to the national income distribution, or relative to each other potentially, to kind of give us something that has at least to us, a more intuitive connection to thinking about kind of distributional divergence or convergence. This, for example, I don't want to get into math in presentation like this, but conceptually using kind of cumulative distribution functions, what these curves are doing are kind of measuring distances between national and local CDFs in the absolute, or what we are calling the absolute version of this regional income divergence curve. Each point in the distribution gets a value that answers the question, by how many dollars would the income of someone at the peak state percentile have to change to match the income of someone at that same national percentile. Similarly, we can do what we're calling the relative version of this exercise, which answers the question, how far apart are the percentile values associated with X dollars of income in the national and local income distributions. So for the rest of my time, I want to show you a little bit of like how these curves, what these curves can tell us just descriptively about how states differ and how they evolve over time. And then I'll show you at the very end a little bit about how we've been able so far to use these curves to analyze potential drivers of regional income divergence or convergence. So just kind of to take a quick example, using the relative regional income divergence curve that we've developed, looking at California in 1998, we can see that kind of over most of the distribution, California was pretty close to the national distribution. So values of 0 here show that that particular percentile of a state was kind of directly in line with the national distribution. California is a bit higher income especially in the top of the distribution, but overall pretty close to the nation as a whole. By 2017 though, almost all of California's income distribution had shifted up relative to the national distribution. When we break out California incomes by race, we can see that even in 1998, kind of this familiar pattern, I guess, of white incomes being relatively high compared to Black and Hispanic and Native American incomes in particular. Asian incomes were also high relative to the nation, though low relative to whites in California. By 2017, everyone's incomes had kind of shifted up a bit, but it remained the case that white and Asian incomes were high relative to Black, Hispanic, and Native American incomes. Looking at kind of a lower income state, the story is very similar. Here, Mississippi has kind of lower income at every percentile, or is lower in the national distribution at every percentile in 98 and remains so in 17, having made little progress relative to the nation as a whole over that period. Breaking them out again by race, we see that white and Asian incomes are relatively high compared to Black, Hispanic, and Native incomes, though now the relatively high white incomes are kind of merely in line with the national distribution rather than kind of shifted right as they were in California. And again, over this period, minimal gains for each group, but the kind of relative standings of the groups are little changed. So kind of descriptively, there's a lot you can learn about kind of patterns of income differences across distributions just by looking at our kind of relative regional income divergence curve here. In particular, our kind of summary takeaway from this portion is that it's across time, across rich and poor states, the kind of relative standing of race groups is very similar and very stable. So the last thing I want to do today is kind of use these income divergence curve ordinates as outcomes in a quick and dirty kind of horse race kind of analysis of what we think could potentially be driving changes in income divergence over this period. There's a lot of candidates, some kind of inspired by Peter's prior work. Migration could play a role in changes in divergence over time, housing costs, some policy levers might play a role, industry mix, union density. We're very open to considering additional possibilities. These are the ones we start with.
Kevin, about 90 seconds, I think.
Sure. That's all I need. We're basically going to do just a long difference regression in each ordinate of this curve and these various policy measures. The thing that emerges here, I guess, is that as we might have expected from peers, where housing prices seem like they're good candidates to play an important role throughout a lot of the distribution, and these other things are kind of smaller in magnitude, a little bit muddled, not super significant. So this was not by any means a super causal analysis, but at first pass, some answers here are expected, like the importance of housing prices. A lot of work remains to be done to kind of pull this all into a coherent framework. So to kind of close out here, what we found here are that the top 15% of state income distributions have been diverging over the last 2 decades, while the rest of the distributions have continued to converge. This is something you would not have learned from just considering the mean. There are differences in convergence patterns across races, with that top divergence being driven by white and Asian incomes. The relative standing of race groups is similar across rich and poor states, and again, fairly stable over time. And so kind of the questions raised by this that we want to focus more on going forward are thinking about whether these facts are consistent with existing theories of regional income convergence, thinking about potential policies or economic conditions that drive regional income divergence. And I think connecting back to Brad's work, we do going forward want to bring in some information about safety net programs and whether considering income on kind of a post-tax and transfer basis would alter this story much. I guess the last thing I want to say is that this work is kind of part of a broader data project on measuring local income inequality and mobility. We are very interested in hearing from anyone who has thoughts on what types of measures we should construct, or what income concepts are interesting, or anything else you think would be cool to see produced as pertains to local income inequality and mobility that seems feasible given the data we've just been talking about. Conceptually, what we want these measures to do is kind of capture people's experience of the economy in a way that kind of more standard measures don't do quite as much. So if you have any thoughts on that, on the research, on anything else, feel free to be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. And Peter, go ahead when you're ready.
Can everyone hear me okay? Can you see my screen share? Okay,
yes, and yes.
So that's great. All right, so I'm going to discuss the 2 papers in the order that they were presented. So the first paper, the response of the social safety net to recessions, shows that transfers cover 10 to 30% of the regional earnings loss from a recession. And there are a lot of papers I know which do household level analysis of income loss from both idiosyncratic job loss and also aggregate shocks to the economy. This is the first paper I know of that answers this question from a regional perspective. And so I think that alone is an important contribution, is actually going to shape a bunch of my questions and comments about the paper. So first, the paper, and also this was also present, I was glad this was present in the presentation because it means I wasn't focusing on the wrong part of the paper, says that there's the fact that there's incomplete replacement, so only 10 to 30% of the regional earnings loss from more severely hit regions is replaced, speaks to the inadequacy of transfers. And the statement implies, at least the way I read it, that only complete replacement of lost earnings would be adequate. And I think I have, the question I would ask is, well, what would we have expected to find? If we hadn't seen your paper and you just asked, any of the economists who are in this session, what would you have expected to find as the regional earnings replacement rate? I don't think you would have expected it to be 100%. So first, from a positive perspective, there's no social insurance program in the US that aims to replace all of lost earnings. And so there's no program that seeks to do this. This is also related actually to something that came up in the questions. In the questions from the audience, Julia Pollack, who I used to work with as a research assistant when we were both undergraduates, asked, well, what policies do you think would change this? And I think there's a wide range of policies that could change this, but I think the starting point is there's no policy levers that seek to make up for lost earnings at a regional level. And then second, I don't think that any social insurance program should have the aim of replacing all of lost earnings. So let me explain the logic behind that point. So if you were to replace all lost earnings forever, that would be equivalent to a 100% tax rate on any earnings that were below what your pre-job loss earnings were. And if you had a policy which did replace all earnings pre-job loss, that would be inconsistent with the optimal income tax, because there's a Pareto improvement that's available by lowering the income tax rate from 100% down. And so I guess I sort of found myself thinking, I would hope the replacement rate is greater than 0, but I don't think the replacement rate of 1 is something that any policy seeks to do or that any policy should seek to do. The second suggestion that I have is to compare the regional estimates in this paper, which are really quite novel, to the relatively broad literature on micro estimates. So this procedure I could imagine happening in 2 steps. So in the first step, you could calculate estimates of the income smoothing per job year lost from the transfers, and then compare to household level estimates. And this could be analysis of micro data. And you mentioned there's a bunch of papers that look at what happens to income on a micro level of job loss. And then also you could look at a tax and transfer simulator and say, what would we expect to find from a tax and transfer simulator at an individual level? I think there's a helpful analogy of a literature which has done a really nice job of navigating these issues that I want to bring up, which is the literature on the micro versus macro duration elasticity with respect to unemployment insurance. So there's a micro estimate of how much does unemployment insurance discourage job search, and then there are macro or affect job search, and then there are macro estimates of the same parameter, which sort of take the household level approach and take the regional approach. And that's a literature that's done a really nice job of laying out what are the reasons why these estimates might differ. So in that context, they emphasize labor market congestion and demand externalities. I think it would be useful to similarly here walk through both quantitatively how do the estimates compare between sort of the regional approach you're taking in the micro literature, but also at a conceptual level, why might these estimates differ? I have one more question, which is sort of related in spirit to my point about the replacement rate, optimal replacement rate not being 100, which is what is the optimal regional replacement rate for lost earnings? And again, I think connecting to the micro literature here would yield new insights. So I think it would be useful to walk through why might the regional replacement rate differ from the individual replacement rate? Like, why should it? And then let me give one concrete example. So suppose that the Midwest, where I live, which is sadly a declining region by most measures, is experiencing permanent changes in productivity. And recessions are one way that those permanent changes in productivity show up in the labor market. It's not, full insurance will prevent people from reallocating across regions. And I think we actually potentially want people to reallocate to more productive regions. I mean, I would be sad to see them go because I live in Chicago, but that doesn't mean that that's not the right thing for the economy as a whole. And so I think it would be useful to think about what should the regional replacement rate be, taking into account the fact that there are costs to preventing regional reallocation and potentially in productivity terms. And maybe that's another paper. I'm not sure that has to fit in the same paper, but I think it seems like an interesting and important question. So to summarize, I started out by asking, what would we have expected to find? And the paper sort of said, well, we're surprised that it's not 100%. And I'm saying, I actually think that full regional, I wrote placement, but that's a typo. It should say full regional replacement is both unlikely and undesirable. Second, I think it would be useful to compare regional estimates to micro estimates. I think that would enlighten our understanding of both types of estimates. And I think it would also be great to think about what is the optimal regional replacement rate for lost earnings. So overall, I think these are really exciting findings, and I'm glad I had the chance to discuss the paper. I'm now going to turn to the second paper, Re-examining Regional Income Convergence, a Distributional Approach. So this is part of an ambitious data project that Kevin mentioned, but I want to re-emphasize, thinking about regional distributional income. And it reminds me a little bit of, although it's not the same as, the Piketty-Sias-Zuckerman idea of doing distributional national accounts. So they're thinking about mapping GDP growth to different parts of the income distribution. Here it's about the distribution of income by place, but I think this is, I intend this as a compliment. I think this is ambitious in a good way, and there's potential less useful lessons you can import from there. This data set that you're working with has both improvements in sample size and data quality over the American Community Survey, which has about 2 million people per year who are responding to the survey. And a question I have for the broad project is, what questions can you answer that the ACS cannot? So many of the plots you showed during the talk today, you could make with the ACS. And so it's useful to figure out what is the highest and best use of this new data? What's the novel innovation that won't be possible with the American Community Survey? Second, I wanted to, that's about the project. So now I'm going to dive into the paper, or there's not a paper yet, but the extended abstract. So first, I want to talk about the contribution of this paper. So, and the best way to do that is relative to prior findings about work on income convergence. So US states converged in terms of their income from 1880 to 1980. And then the rate of convergence declined since for the period, if you're looking at endpoints between 1990 and 2010. Mean income convergence has slowed dramatically. That was sort of the headline conclusion in our paper. And we also showed that median income convergence had also slowed to a rate that was about 1/2 the rate that was happening for most of the 20th century. So this paper has updated estimates through 2017 instead of through 2010. So that's great. These updated estimates yield new insights. So at the mean for the most recent time period, there's no convergence. And so that means the patterns that are identified in Ganong and Shoag of a slowing down of the rate of income convergence have basically only been amplified in the recent period as the income convergence rate goes from being small to in fact being 0. And then there's also estimates about the median income convergence rate, which to my read are similar to the estimates in Ganong and Shoag. So that's I sort of see as the contribution of the paper. So I have a suggestion, but you know that your discussant is useless when the material suggestions have already appeared in the chat. So Alex Bartik made the same comment in the chat already, which is it would be useful to capture this distributional approach over time, because if you think about the point of in many of the prior papers, it's about what did behavior look like in one time period compared to another time period, and so the ability to do that contrast I think is really valuable. The high quality income data appear to be available only from 1995 forward, but you can use the income in the decennial census to go back farther, and I think that would answer Alex's question, and I think it would help to make the paper stronger. A second question that I have, and this is to be genuinely a question, I don't know what the right answer is what's the appropriate regressor? So convergence regressions take the form of having a baseline level and then a change. And if you think about sort of the classic Barrow and Salahi-Martin work, they use the mean lagged value of income, and they argue that this is going to capture the return to capital. Our paper following theirs used the mean lagged outcome again. For the most part, we looked at median a bit, but that wasn't the primary focus. For a range of different outcome variables, we also used the skill-specific mean when we were trying to predict migration behavior. And then Otter, in his LE lecture, he's not exactly studying convergence, but he's studying many of the same substantive patterns, uses density in 1970. That's his sort of baseline driving variable. One common feature of all three of these approaches, with the sort of exception of the migration regressions, is that they use the same regressor when looking at different outcomes. So the regressor is held constant, and then the outcome variable changes across the analysis. And so that's actually different than what's done here. So here, the paper uses income percentiles. So for example, what's the lagged income at the 10th percentile? What's the change in income at the 10th percentile? And the reason that I think this is, I want to emphasize this difference is I think that it means that states can move around. So for example, DC is it's not a state, but close to a state, which is very unequal in terms of incomes. And so if you look carefully at the sort of plots that Kevin showed, DC is quite high in terms of mean income, but is actually quite low in terms of its 10th percentile income. And so the ranking is moving around. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like it could be that that's desirable or it's undesirable, but I think it would be useful to add additional argument for why it makes sense to use a constant baseline, which is what much of the prior different literature has done, or to use different baselines. I tried to think about, well, what's an argument why you might want to use the 10th percentile consistently? So maybe the argument is something like a migrant who gets the 10th percentile wage in the old state will also get the 10th percentile wage in the new state. I can think of pros and cons. I'm not sure I believe that argument, but I'm just trying to sort of think out loud about what might justify this choice. But I think the choice needs some explicit justification, and it's not obvious to me that you want to have states moving around in their ranking as part of this analysis. So to summarize, the first question I asked is, what are the highest and best uses of this new data tool? Second, I suggested to compare estimates over time, although you didn't need me for that because Alex had the same suggestion. And finally, I suggested that you do more to motivate the choice of regressor and consider the choice of regressor. Overall, I think this is a powerful data tool, and I'm really excited about the author's focus on their regional income distribution.
Thanks, Peter. And I do want to acknowledge our discussants are both doing 2 papers, which I think is a large amount of work, but I have found at least it makes the discussion really great and can be great for the discussants who undertake it too. So we have just a couple of minutes for questions, and I think for the sake of time, I will pull out just a couple from the chat. And I wanted to turn back to one really for the first paper for Brad, that is kind of really the general question is about the role of employment participation and participation in the labor market in some of the findings that you are reporting. So I think if you can say, I'll kind of read the specific question, and if you can say a little bit more about how you're thinking about the participation margin in this, that would be great. So this question is from Andrew Dumont. Do you think these trends of long-term increases in non-means tested transfers are the result of workers in these particularly hard-hit areas being more likely to leave the labor force earlier than their counterparts in less hard-hit areas? And I think this links to Peter's point in the discussion about what should the optimal replacement rate be at this kind of local level. You know, Peter was making the point about more and less productive places, and do we want workers to reallocate? It's possible that workers who choose to drop out have themselves seen their skills become obsolete, and potentially this is a form of reallocation that we want to see. I don't know. But I think in general, kind of thoughts you have on that participation margin on any of those 3 or 4 questions that were bundled in there. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, those are all great questions. Thanks, Abby, and thanks for the questioners for asking them. We do think a lot of it is tied to changes in labor force participation and employment rates. And in the companion paper, as I mentioned, we do find persistent declines in employment rates. We want to delve a little bit more deeply in figuring out the distribution of that, what types of people are less likely to work, how long does that last? And so we have an ongoing project with Kevin, actually, looking into the RDCs and the LEHD, where we're going to try to look at that and try to parse that a little bit more carefully. And then turning to Peter's point about what should the optimal transfer rate be, that was probably a framing error on our part. We didn't necessarily want to argue in an normative sense that there should be a 100% replacement rate, but more about what types of transfers are responding, and that those might not be the right ones, but that we need to have an optimal response going forward, that everything is kind of income replacement in the short run, when what we want going forward is more something that is either augmenting human capital or otherwise helping with the labor market. Perhaps some of that is with geographic reallocation funds to get people to move to other places. In some cases, that may be place-based policies that invest in the place themselves to increase productivity there. There's been a recent resurgence in interest in that topic as well. What we view our results as emphasizing the need for that the current structure of the safety net is inadequate because these gaps are existing over the long period of time. That doesn't mean I think that we wanted to scale them up to 100% replacement rate, but the nature and structure of them probably need to be reconsidered. And I know we don't have much time, but Bryan may be able to answer or add some comments too.
No, I'm happy. I think we can keep this moving.
Okay, thanks. So I pulled out another question for Kevin and John's paper from Lyndon McBride. This was about really the kind of state level, and I am interested in hearing from either of you about why the state level itself is interesting. I was trying to think about that a bit myself, which is why do we expect states to be moving around in this distribution? And do we expect kind of continued convergence? Do we expect, how do we expect states to look at different percentiles? Lyndon's question is specifically about kind of the county or metro level type analysis you might do. The question says, given considerable heterogeneity within states, especially rural urban differences, do you have thoughts about whether the findings would differ at lower levels of disaggregation? Would you see the same types of convergence divergence across counties rather than states? So Kevin or John, either of you, go ahead.
Kevin, I think you're muted.
I definitely expect to see more heterogeneity as we get down to kind of finer levels of geography, and that's kind of one of the directions we're planning to go. Like as Peter mentioned, like what's the best use of these data, and one of the top uses we think is going to be using them to kind of hone in on finer geographic areas. And there are some kind of privacy related issues we have to deal with before we kind of put that kind of information out into the world, but that's kind of one of the directions we're hoping to go in the future. So I definitely expect to see more heterogeneity once we get there. I guess we'll have to, I guess I don't have like a strong existing view on how getting down to finer levels of geography would affect our kind of convergence divergence findings. I think we'll have to see what happens when we get there. But it's a direction we're definitely hoping to go.
Thanks, Kevin. And I thought we had John Voorheis on, but I think we don't. But I'm going to shift us over to the next set of papers. Kevin, if you have a chance to go in and answer questions in the Q&A, that'd be great. I think people have been getting good comments in there. Next up is John Coglianese, and we're actually connecting on the participation margin question. So take it away, John.
Thanks. Excuse me. I want to thank the organizers for picking this paper. We're really excited to hear your feedback and your questions. This is joint work with two of my colleagues at the Federal Reserve Board, Tomaz Cajner and Joshua Montes. And the usual disclaimer applies that these are our views and not the views of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or its staff. We're going to talk today about what we're calling the long-lived cyclicality of the labor force participation rate, which was new to us and we want to share with all of you. So as some background motivation, when we're interested in business cycles, interested in total output in the economy, you can break that down. Most of the fluctuations in total output, or a fair number of them, come from total employment. And there's a nice identity that total employment can be written as the product of the labor force participation rate, which I've highlighted in blue, and 1 minus the unemployment rate, which I've highlighted in orange. The labor force participation rate is the share of the population that's either working or looking for work. And that typically gets less emphasis in discussions of business cycles. Most of business cycle macro focuses only on the unemployment rate and omits any discussion of the cyclicality in the LFPR. But importantly, the LFPR could be very cyclical too. In practice, though, it's difficult to disentangle cyclical movements in the LFPR from trend movements. And let me show you what I mean by that. This is a graph showing the labor force participation rate in the United States since the late 70s. And you can see that it does appear to move during business cycles. So following the most recent four most recent MBR recessions up until the one last year, you can see that the LFPR dips after the recession and then slowly recovers sometime after that. But this pattern is layered on top of very large trend movements. So the entry of women into the workforce in the 1980s and 1990s, and then the retirement of baby boom generation, particularly in the 2000s and in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And that makes it a little bit difficult to figure out how much of these movements are cyclical, how much are due to trend, and when the right turning point is. And so when we look at the labor force participation rate at the end of this period, has it fully cyclically recovered? Is it depressed from cyclical factors or trend factors? These are questions that are somewhat difficult to answer just from the national time series. And so we're going to come in with a slightly different approach. And to try and identify how cyclical the LFPR is, we're going to look at state level business cycles. We think this is an approach that's somewhat underutilized for looking at cyclicality along different margins. There are some precedents in the literature, like a paper by Ursig and Levin, and there's a large regional literature with Blanchard-Katz being a big contribution there that look at the LFPR over state level business cycles. We're going to have some methodological differences from that. We're going to measure cyclicality with local projections regressions. And we think that's going to be very important for this setting because it's not going to have us, we're not going to need to take stances on what underlying trends are. We're not going to be baking in any assumptions about mean reversion. And it's going to be much more transparent exactly what the cyclicality of the LFPR is, rather than a VAR framework where some of the assumptions get a little bit hidden. Lastly, we think it's important to account for changes in labor force composition. When there are local shocks that can induce changes in the population, certain people may move out of the area. The migration response to local shocks is a well-documented phenomenon. But particularly since we're looking at labor force participation, which varies by so much over different parts of the life cycle, we want to take into account that any changes in the age composition of the population could really affect the estimates. So we're going to account for that in our framework. So let me move right into the details of what we do. We're going to run a series of local projections regressions to trace out the impulse response of the LFPR, which is the term here, to changes in state level output, which is denoted by GSP for gross state product. This is the series put out by BEA that measures output at the state level. It's the equivalent of actually gross domestic income at the national level. So it's measuring output using an income concept. And they align the income to the timing of production. So if you get a bonus in one year, that really applies to the previous year when the work was done. So this is a measure of state level output that we're going to look at changes in state level output and measure how that affects changes in the LFPR. We're going to normalize everything to show recessions, since that's the sort of business cycle that we're interested in. We're going to control for state and year fixed effects, and we'll cluster our standard errors at the state level. And the other thing I really want to mention is that for our outcome, we're going to be looking at annual age sex adjusted measures of the labor market, primarily the LFPR, but also the unemployment rate and the employment to population ratio, all measured in the CPS from the late 70s through 2018. I'll come back to the issue of demographic adjustment. We think age sex adjustment is a natural place to start because that's one of the primary dimensions on which LFPR varies among people. But we'll come back to that adjustment and how it affects our estimates a little bit later. Now, I mentioned we're going to be using changes in state level output. You might be worried, particularly since it's measured as income concept, that that's going to be somewhat endogenous. And so we're going to instrument for changes in state level output with a Bartik instrument similar to how things have been done in the literature. This is a natural instrument for looking at regional shocks. We're going to form this by multiplying national, leave one out, GDP growth by industry with the lagged industry share in each state. The product of those combined gives you this shift share instrument. One thing I do want to note is that we're doing all of this using output, which is a little bit different than the approach that's been used in the literature in Blanchard-Katz and other papers that have followed that, that have all used national shocks to employment by industry, whereas here we're going to use national shocks to output. We think this is a better approach for a few reasons. Output is going to be more comprehensive. It's going to include changes in productivity that may not correspond to changes in employment. We also think it's going to be better timed. If there are rigidities in the economy, it may be that employment falls over a longer period, whereas output is going to immediately adjust. And so by using an output measure, we're going to be able to better capture the exact beginning of shocks and then measure how those play out. And also, we think it's just more relevant for policy that by focusing on output, that'll be the equivalent thing we can take to a national level and look at national recessions. So with that, let me get into the results. So here, this is the main graph of the paper, and so I want to take a few minutes to walk you through this. In blue, we're showing the response to a 1% change in output, negative 1% change in output of the unemployment rate. In orange, we're showing the LFPR, and then in green, we're showing the employment population ratio, which is sort of a combination of the blue and the orange line. What you can see is that immediately after the shock, so we've normalized everything to the year before the shock, in the 2 years after the shock, the unemployment rate spikes and hits about 0.4 percentage points higher. This is in line with standard estimates of Okun's law that a 1% decline in GDP would give you somewhere in the order of a 0.4, 0.5 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. But what I want to focus on most is the LFPR here in orange. You can see that this takes about, steadily declines over the course of about 4 years, reaching a trough at about 0.2 below the shock. And then it's not until after about 4 years that it starts to recover and eventually returns to a pre-shock level at about 8 years following the output shock. And what this means is that there's a very different timing between the cyclicality of the unemployment rate and the cyclicality of the LFPR, where the unemployment rate spikes very early and then begins recovering within a year or two. And by 6 years out, the unemployment rate is essentially fully recovered. The LFPR, though, is going to continue declining for much longer, and then its recovery is much more delayed. And so there's this window of time between sort of 6 to 8 years after the recession when, if you just looked at the unemployment rate, you think that the economy has fully recovered. But in fact, there's still a lot more room to grow along the LFPR margin. So we call this the long-lived cyclicality of the LFPR, that it is cyclical, but with much more delay relative to the unemployment. And those two combine to give this pattern in green, where the employment to population ratio falls very quickly, but then takes quite a long time to fully recover, combining those two different margins. So we think that's the main result of the paper, is showing that the LFPR is cyclical, but in a very delayed, long-lived way. Now let me show you some of the other things that we do in the paper. So I mentioned earlier that we use age sex-adjusted LFPR in our main results. But we could think of alternative adjustments or using an unadjusted LFPR. And so we think it's useful to compare our main results to two different benchmarks. The first one is the unadjusted LFPR. And so this difference between our main results and this benchmark reflect changes in the age distribution of the population. The second benchmark, I think, would be natural, would be to add in additional demographic factors. So we add in education, race, ethnicity, and marital status, and adjust for all of those at the same time. And the difference between our main results and this benchmark reflect the influence of other demographic factors beyond age. So let me show you what happens when you use those. Here in orange, I'm showing you our main results again. The LFPR falls by about 0.2 over about 4 years and then recovers by about 8 years. If we compare this to our two benchmarks, in green, I'm showing you the benchmark that adjusts for all of the demographics, and in blue is the unadjusted LFPR. And what you can see is that our main results using age-sex adjusted LFPR are very similar to the version that adjusts for all of the demographics, but very different than the unadjusted version. What's happening is that there are big shifts in the age distribution of the population that are slowly pulling down on the LFPR over time. And so when we adjust for age distribution, we're able to find that the LFPR fully recovers, even though in unadjusted terms, the LFPR is permanently lower by about 0.2. But it doesn't appear that there are big shifts in the population distribution beyond age that we should be concerned about for measuring the cyclicality of LFPR. Because when we adjust for education and race and ethnicity and marital status as well, we find very similar results to our main specification. If you take the difference between these two lines in the unadjusted LFPR, you can see that this represents sort of the predicted LFPR just based on demographics. That is falling over time, whether you look at the age-sex version or the version that adjusts for more variables. And what that's implying is that the population is becoming more skewed towards groups with lower LFPRs. And we can show that directly. So we're going to next turn to looking at which age groups in particular are driving this. And we'll use some data from Census about the covered area population, the resident population, I should say. These graphs are going to be a little bit different. So instead of showing the time along the x-axis, this is showing the response for, I'll show you different graphs for different time periods following the shock. The x-axis here is age, and these dots represent different regressions for each single year age group following a shock. So you can see 0 years after the shock, there's the population is little changed. But by 2 years after the shock, the population for people in their 20s and early 30s is significantly lower than it was before the shock. So all of these graphs are showing you the percent change in the single year age population for that age group relative to before the shock. But not for any other age groups. So for the very young, for workers older than 40, there's really not much change in the population for those groups. This gets more extreme 5 years after the shock, where we see even larger declines of about 2 to 3% for workers in or for individuals in their late 20s and early 30s. And by 10 years after the shock, this gets even more extreme. But what's happening is that these workers who are in the so-called prime years of their career, they tend to have very high participation rates. And so when you see the population of those individuals leave the area, that mechanically pulls down the participation rate for that area. And the fact that we're not seeing any similar change in population for either older individuals, or we even see a little bit of an increase among the very youngest individuals, that is further going to mechanically lower the LFPR. So that drives the result that I showed you on the previous slide, where just using the unadjusted LFPR, you'd see this permanent decrease in participation. And that's coming from selected migration on age, where these high LFPR age groups are leaving on net the population. So we have some other results in the paper that I'll mention in the few minutes that I have left. So first, we break this down by demographic group, and we find there are some big differences in both how large the cyclicality of the LFPR is, but also how long-lived it is for different demographic groups. And in particular, for young workers, the LFPR tends to take a very long time to recover. For less educated workers, the LFPR takes a long time to recover. And particularly for Black workers, the LFPR takes up to 10 years to recover back to its pre-recession level. And we think this matters because I talked earlier about that window where the unemployment rate has fully recovered, but the LFPR hasn't yet recovered. It's these specific demographic groups that are going to disproportionately benefit from a sustained recovery during that period. These are the demographic groups who haven't yet recovered when the unemployment rate is back down. But if we can sustain the recovery a little bit longer, their LFPR will return back to where it was. We do a little bit of an investigation of what seems to be driving this, what reasons people give for leaving the labor force during this cyclical response. And you can think of most of what is going on are sort of persistent or semi-permanent decisions about how to spend time. So people go back to school, they go home to take care of their home or family. We see higher rates of illness or disability and being out of the labor force. But we don't see this long-lived pattern being explained by discouraged workers. We don't see it being explained by retirements. So we think as people are thinking about business cycles and the sort of long-lived cyclicality, it's important to keep these reasons in your mind, that people are going back to school, people are going home to take care of their home or family, or people are leaving the labor force for illness or disability reasons rather than just being discouraged. And then lastly, we see similar responses to expansionary and contractionary shocks. We have more, there's some difference in the amount of those shocks that we have. But broadly, expansionary and contractionary shocks look very symmetric, which was a little bit surprising to us. So with that, let me wrap up. So we've introduced a new approach, combining some things that have been done before in the literature, but bringing in local projections regressions, focusing on shocks to output, and specifically Bartik output shocks. And with that, we find that the LFPR has this long-lived cyclicality where the unemployment rate reacts much faster. The LFPR takes quite a long time both to reach its trough, but then also to fully recover. And this leads to a window where the unemployment rate appears to have fully recovered, but the labor market still has room to grow on the LFPR margin. And this is particularly important for particular demographic groups, primarily young workers, less educated workers, and minority workers, who stand to benefit the most from sustaining that recovery through that window. So I think I'm just about out of time, so I will stop there. Thanks.
Great, that was perfect on timing. Thanks, John. And now we have Eliza Forsythe talking about the geography of jobs. I'm just once again going to encourage folks to put comments even or questions for John in the Q&A, and he will have a chance to turn to them right now. Go ahead, Eliza.
All right, can everybody hear me okay and see my slides? All right, so well, thanks a lot to Kevin for organizing the session, Abby for moderating, and a big thanks to LERA for discussing our very preliminary project. So we're really looking forward to any and all feedback. This is joint with Alex Bartik, who will be managing the chat and the Q&A. And also we want to thank Burning Glass Technologies, who provided the data that makes it possible for doing what we're doing. Okay, so the goal of this project is we want to understand how occupations and jobs vary across local labor markets. And this is just a picture just to give a flavor of the kinds of things we're interested in. We're looking at what's the deviation in skill shares for the top 100 skills for computer programming jobs. And you see there's substantial geographic variation across the country, and even labor markets that are close to each other have very different skill distributions. So it suggests that these types of occupations really vary, could potentially vary geographically. So the motivation is, we know that there's large differences in wages and job availability geographically, which leads to the question of why more individuals don't migrate. So, Abby has done work on this in terms of falling geographic mobility in the US. And one explanation that we're interested in exploring is whether or not within occupational skill requirements vary across labor markets. So is a computer programming job in Silicon Valley the same as a computer programming job in, say, Indiana? And maybe the fact that these look like they're similar based on their occupation, if they have a really different skill requirement in the task space of the occupation, maybe people aren't migrating because they don't actually have the qualifications necessary for these jobs in other geographic areas. This is also relevant for thinking about the job mismatch, so the skills of individuals who lost work and whether or not they're similar to the skills that are demanded by firms that are hiring. So I've done some work looking at this in the current pandemic era, but we find little evidence of increasing mismatch during this era. But this kind of is assuming that jobs are substitutes within occupations, right? So again, if there's important differences within occupations, then we're going to be under measuring mismatch between workers and jobs. And the more segmented these jobs are, that could again make it more likely for there to be mismatch, which could also potentially slow down recoveries. So we think it's relevant for thinking about sort of the cyclical dimension of employment and job loss. And then finally, changes in skills within occupations across space and time may provide information on the spread and adoption of new technologies. So we see this, the methodology that we're building up here as a way for thinking about how are jobs changing right now, and how do we think about emerging skills and emerging technology. So our empirical approach and research questions, so we're using burning glass technology, online job posting data. For the larger project, we're using data from 2007 to the beginning of 2020. Today, we're going to be talking about a subset of this data. And what we're going to do is perform cluster analysis on detailed job characteristics to construct a data-driven classification of jobs. And so we'll use the information in the job postings to cluster jobs into a different classification system. And this is going to allow us to answer some research questions. So how well do occupations describe the characteristics of jobs? Are there natural subdivisions, or are there natural groupings that span occupations, right? So our clusters could divide occupations, or they could pull them together and say maybe actually the SOC occupational classification is too disaggregated. And then we can also look at what are the geographic boundaries of occupations. So do occupations in different places share task and qualifications, or are they effectively different occupations? So do we have this sort of segmentation geographically within occupational groups? When we do the cluster analysis, are we seeing that they're actually distinct? So for today, we're going to do a case study. So we're going to be looking at computer programming occupations and just use data from 2018. And we see this as a proof of concept for the larger project that's going to be using more of this data that we have available. This was a manageable subset that we can both sort of process in a reasonable amount of time, and also can kind of think through what is this classification showing us. So our data, this is the online job postings data that is scraped by Burning Glass Technologies. So this is in your census of online job ads. Nationwide geographic coverage, there's about 120 million postings through the full time period. And the big value added that Burning Glass provides is they parse the text into phrases and common requirements. So they're going to pull out things like education and experience. And then we'll also have a really long list of phrases, keyword phrases that show up in the job ads that they call skills. The job ads are matched to the city and county of the workplace. This is going to allow us to look at really narrowly defined geographic areas. Although today we're going to be focusing on commuting zones. And this has been widely studied to look at labor demand. So, Brad's worked with this data. Lisa Kahn has done a lot of work with this data. I have previous work on this data. So it's been well validated and well studied. And so it's a really good data source for looking at labor demand with a really fine degree of detail. So the traditional method of thinking about what are occupations, so we're thinking about the SOC codes, and the goal is to classify similar jobs based on things like work performed, the skills, the education. This is being driven by sort of the statistical needs of these government agencies. So there's this goal to kind of limit the number of occupations so we have enough power in each cell. And so that's going to sort of partially determine how fine of a mesh that we have, right? So we could think that every job is its own individual snowflake and in its own little cell, right? We need to aggregate together so we can say something meaningful about groups of jobs and groups of occupations. And then job titles are linked to occupations. So that's a way to go from the employer data on job titles to get us to these occupational classifications. And what's crucial here is that it's independent of geography. And also there's infrequent updates to classification. So these are both things that are by design. Anybody that's worked with occupational crosswalks, we don't want the crosswalks to change every single month or every single year, right? So this is all good features of the SOC data. And this is something that is an important way for thinking about occupations. So we want to have an alternative approach that we're not trying to supplant this. We're just saying, what's another way that we can look within occupations using this really, really rich job posting data to think about heterogeneity. So by using the job postings data, we don't need to take an a priori stand on the number of occupations or how many observations are in each cell. We can really allow the data to guide us into what's the appropriate classification. And it's going to allow us to let these clusters differ across space and time. The other thing that's really nice about it is we can think about a continuous distance between occupations because we have this really, really rich data on all of the characteristics of the job. And so we can put that into a Euclidean space and think about distance, which we'll do a little bit with today and more in the future. Okay, so the way that this data is structured, so we're focusing on these skills, which are really these phrases that are going to show up in the job ad. So that's going to be things like Excel or communication skills or a team player, right? So all of these phrases, and so each job posting is going to have a vector of dummies for whether or not each individual skill or phrase is present in the job ad. And unlike other textual data, that frequency is an important component of understanding the characteristics of the text. Here, skills typically only appear once in a job ad, and so our data is really, it's all going to be binary in terms of either this is present or it's not present. And so we're going to use these vectors to group these job postings into these broader groups or these clusters. So in order to do that, there's a few steps. So first, you need to come up with a distance metric between each job posting, right? So we need to be able to say, are two job postings close together? Or are they far apart? And for that, we're going to use a cosine similarity index. So this is just the cosine of the angle between the two vectors, and it works relatively well for this type of data. The second step is to choose an algorithm to construct the clusters given the distance metric that you've chosen. And so what we're going to use is the k-medioid algorithm and then this Birch refinement of it. And so the idea here is that essentially you take all your data, you kind of randomly assign it to clusters. For each of those clusters, you determine what's the medioid, so what's the midpoint in that cluster, and then you reiterate and take all the data and assign it to its closest medioid. And so basically what you'll just keep iterating until you stop improving. And so until the clusters, every observation is in the cluster with the closest medioid. And so that's the basic idea. The Birch algorithm is just a way of building on that improves the efficiency of the algorithm and is more appropriate for the size of the data that we're working with. And then the last thing is choosing the optimal number of clusters. So these procedures are all based on, you pre-specify, we think there's 10 clusters, and then you can perform the algorithm, but we don't want to define ahead of time how many clusters there should be. And so what we'll use is this gap statistic. And the idea of the gap statistic is you construct a counterfactual distribution where your data is uniformly distributed. And then for each number of clusters, you see how much improvement you're gaining over those number of clusters for the uniformly distributed data. And so once we're at a point where the clusters, we're not really gaining anything by adding more clusters, we're not going to be improving upon that number of clusters for the uniform distribution, because for the uniform distribution, there's not going to be any, there's no natural clustering, right? So each time you add a different cluster, you're just subdividing the data more. And so that's sort of the procedure that we'll use to come up with the number of clusters. Okay, and then the last thing, just for thinking about how do we interpret what we get out of this, this exercise. So we can compare clusters to the occupational classifications that come out of the SOC. So the clusters may divide SOC occupations, and so that's going to suggest that the relevant occupational submarket is actually narrower than the SOC definition, right? So if we have a cluster that we split an SOC occupation in two, that's going to suggest that people that are in one side of that occupation are not necessarily well suited for jobs in the other side of the occupation. So that's one thing the clusters could do. On the other hand, they could aggregate these occupations, right? So the relevant occupational submarket is actually broader than the SOC definition. And even though you're in this occupation and the job posting is in a different occupation, if they're within the same cluster, that suggests that you might actually have the skills necessary to move to that other occupation. And so these are going to, depending on sort of which of these are at play, or will show that it's a combination of both, that's going to suggest different conclusions about labor market geography. So regions could specialize in certain clusters, which could lead to geographic submarkets, or clusters could be diffused geographically. The nationwide labor market could actually be more integrated than we'd expect from the SOC occupational distribution. Okay, so our results. So this is a case study. We're focusing on software developers and programmers. So there's 4 SOC codes that are in this category. And so there's, in May of 2018, there's 1.7 million people employed in these groups of occupations, and they're all doing relatively similar activities. So if you look at ONET description of these 4 occupations, it's a little hard to distinguish which one is which. So it looks like a good group of occupations that maybe these SOC divisions are not necessarily capturing the relevant distinctions between these types of jobs. And there's substantial heterogeneity across job postings in these occupations in programming languages and software. So again, that's going to be something that, in a job posting, if you really need somebody to work with a particular programming language or a particular software, you're definitely going to put that in the job ad. And so this is also a case study for jobs that we think that are very well described by their online job postings, and the relevant distinctions are going to be included in the job ads. Okay, so we use nationwide data from January 2018. That gives us about 76,000 postings under these 4 occupations. This is why we've cut down to, for this case study, we're only using a small slice of the data because it's a fair amount of data to work with. We'll rely on burning glasses mapping from job titles to SOC codes. And then we're going to focus on the top 100 skills that appear in these job ads. That's going to cut out the skills that we're cutting out are ones that appear in less than 2% of job ads. So the top 100 skills are getting us sort of the bulk of the skills, or the programming languages and software and things like that are present in these jobs. And we'll, as discussed above, we'll apply the clustering algorithm and compute the gap statistic to this reduced data set. Okay, so this is just showing the gap statistic using our clustering in this cosine dissimilarity index, and showing sort of how much we're improving by increasing the number of clusters one by one. And so there's sort of differences of opinion of like what's the best way to choose the stopping point. So essentially you want to choose a point where the gap statistic is flattening out. We're not making any additional improvements. For today, we're going to focus at 6. So, it stops improving once we get to about 6. That's going to mean a small number of clusters that are easy to talk about, but sort of ongoing work for us is figuring out what's the best way to choose the stopping point. Okay, so we'll have 6 clusters, and as sort of a brief description of them, we have some that are sort of web app development, scripting, automating. Cluster 2 is what looks like sort of actual programming. We have several that are very Windows heavy. So we have a Windows web app development. We have this Windows programming light, which has very Windows Office suite type skills, graphical web design. And so just as a sort of snapshot of what are the characteristics, what are the top skills that are in each of these clusters. So this cluster 5, this was the Windows programming light. It's not really asking, the top skills are not actually asking for any programming related skills, right? So this is really just Microsoft Office suite. Versus the cluster 3, this is also Windows-based programming. So this one, 99% of the job ads in this cluster are requiring this ASP.NET MVC. So this is, a really strong cluster. Cluster 2, which is our sort of more serious programming, the top is C++. It's only in 58% of jobs, so it's a bit more diffuse. Cluster 6 is sort of graphical web design. Okay, and so now what we can do is we can say, well, how well do these relate to what we see from the SOC code? So we have our 4 SOC codes. And so what we're saying here is what's the share for each SOC code, what share is coming from each of these clusters. And what you see here is that it's pretty diffuse, right? So we have for software development system software here, about 40% is coming from this cluster 4, but for most of these, there's a good amount of weight coming from these other clusters, right? And so this is suggesting that actually, these, when we're looking at the job postings, we're seeing a lot of these clusters are going across these SOC codes. So it doesn't look like these SOC codes are lining up very well with what we're seeing from these software requirements. And then on the flip side, we can say for each cluster, which share of each cluster is in each SOC code. So the 15.11.32, which is software developer applications, that's sort of the biggest share of the job postings. So that's kind of dominating here. But again, we're seeing that for each of these clusters, they have job postings that would be classified in each of the SOC codes. And so to interpret these results, so again, this is sort of a preliminary first pass of looking at this kind of methodology, but we're seeing is that each of the cluster is requiring substantially different skills, which would suggest that it may be difficult for workers to transition between jobs across the cluster within the same SOC code, right? So we're seeing that within a particular SOC code, there's job postings that have really, really different technology and skill requirements, which might make it difficult for someone to have that type of mobility within the code. And so that's going to suggest that the relevant submarket may be actually narrower than suggested by the SOC codes, right? So people have fewer job opportunities if they were staying in that same, within that SOC code. On the other hand, we see that these clusters are divided across the SOC codes. So people might actually have access to a larger market than suggested from the SOC codes, right? So, so it kind of is, we're seeing both sort of this aggregating up, but also this disaggregating. And we think this is, preliminary but suggestive evidence that the standard occupational classification isn't doing a great job of capturing the relevant divisions between these jobs. Okay, so
well,
now,
Eliza, you're very close to time. So
okay, great, thank you. So
90 seconds, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So just really briefly, so there is a lot of geographic variation. We can show how these different clusters vary geographically. And we can also say, given the characteristics of the commuting zone, which clusters are likely to be in with different characteristics. And so basically what we see is that the more technical clusters, the less window-based clusters are associated with being in commuting zones with higher wages, higher education. The programmers earn a larger share of employment and earn higher wages. And then sort of what's in progress is looking at labor market flows across commuting zones. And so I will leave it at that. But so the future work is really building this out from what we're doing here with programmers and kind of seeing where how we can look at this for the rest of the set of occupations and thinking about these distances and mobility between locations.
Fantastic, thank you. And now we have Laura Giuliano discussing both papers. Go ahead, Laura.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Okay. I'm going to start with the long-lived cyclicality of LFPR. And I want to say thanks to Kevin for inviting me to discuss these papers. Actually, I don't usually get invited to referee macro labor papers, but I really enjoyed reading this one. And it's actually a really nice paper, well written, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. Let's see. I have 4 comments, and I'll try to be quick and leave some time for other experts in the room. So first, the findings clearly illustrate that to fully understand how employment adjusts to business cycle shocks, that the usual focus on headline unemployment rate is insufficient, and that labor force participation deserves more attention. And I found figure 1 that John showed and the comparison of U3 to LFPR and EPOP really helpful. And I also like the formal test presented in the paper for the difference in the time profiles. I also liked the decomposition of those not in the labor force into those who wanted a job and those who didn't, as I think this sheds some light on how much is supply versus demand driven, which is something I'm going to come back to. You show in figure 2 that the LFPR pattern looks more similar to U3 if you focus on individuals who say that they want a job. It recovers more quickly. And you note that this suggests that BLS has more expansive measures of unemployment like U5 are probably able to capture additional cyclicality beyond U3. So what my first thought would be that it would be nice to show a formal test of this. And I'd also be interested in seeing how both U3 and LFPR compare to U6, which includes workers who are part-time for economic reasons. So I just wanted to show this figure, which is from a 2017 CEA report that shows the national BLS series from the beginning through the recovery of the Great Recession. And we can see here that it's true that U4 and U5 peak and recover almost in tandem with U3, but U6 is definitely dragged on for an extra year. So I just wonder if you'd see the same pattern in the state level analysis. And if so, this might tell us something about the reasons for delayed entry or re-entry into the labor force. And my second comment is about generalizability. As the authors acknowledge, the Bartik instrument in this paper is driven largely by 4 industries. That's auto, oil and gas extraction, securities and commodities brokers, and farming. And they present a nice analysis showing that the results are similar when these industries are excluded. Still, I think it might be worth considering generalizability because of the nature of the shocks that are picked up by the Bartik instrument. So on the one hand, they're by definition local, since the estimates are identified off of state variation, and they're confined to specific industries. On the other hand, purely local shocks, like those that would be driven by industries that are concentrated entirely in one state, I don't think they will be captured because there wouldn't be a first stage. So there's questions about whether these shocks differ from more national shocks, and also whether they differ from very local shocks. And obviously, generalizability is hard to assess, but I think it might be worth a short discussion at a minimum. And one thing that might be helpful would be to show how the demographic composition of the industries that drive the results, because you do have some interesting heterogeneity analysis. And so it's possible that the demographics of these industries could help explain the demographic heterogeneity in the LFPR response that you find, and that this might tell you something about how well you could generalize these results to shocks that affect other industries. Third, I want to talk quickly about the migration response. I really like that you addressed this, and I think it's an important analysis and especially interesting in light of previous research like Abby's. It makes a lot of sense that the migration is driven by young adults. I have two comments on this. First, I think there's potential for these estimates to be affected by geographic spillovers, and I've wondered if you've thought about that. If movers tend to migrate to states without contemporaneous shocks, which would make sense if they're migrating in response to labor market opportunities, then the positive spillover effect could lead to an upward bias in your estimates of the migration response. My second thought is that I think you might be a little bit careful about interpreting your findings as evidence either for or against hysteresis. So in the paper, you argue that the persistent fall in LFP due to outmigration is not evidence of hysteresis. And I think you're essentially arguing that if these individuals haven't left the state, that their LFPR would recover in the same way as as others that are in their demographic group. But I guess I'd just be somewhat concerned that leavers are unobservably different from those who stay, and that their LFPR might not follow the same recovery pattern. And it's not clear to me whether that would bias it up or down, but just maybe something to think about. So finally, I want to just come back to this question of what's driving the long-lived cyclicality of LFPR. And I think a basic important question here is whether the cyclicality and slow recovery are driven mainly by supply factors, like individuals not in the labor force are invested in activities such as education that has a persistent labor supply effect, or by demand factors. That is, these individuals who delayed entry or re-entry into the labor force did so because their wages and jobs were recovering more slowly. And I really like your analysis of the reasons for non-participation, but I think you could do a bit more to try to clarify the mechanisms, and in particular to try to reconcile the different pieces of evidence that you present and try to tie it all together. So just I'm going to show figure 2 here, which I don't think you showed in the presentation. I just wanted to say, if we focus on the pattern, which I've re-highlighted in black here, the pattern for those who are not looking for work, and their LFPR response over those 8 years, it looks to me like it closely tracks the pattern for those who are not in the labor force because they say they're not in because they're in school, which is the dark orange. It's a little bit hard to read, but I highlighted that again in dark orange. It looks like that tracks the pattern of LFPR for those who are not looking for a job most closely. And so I'm wondering if that's really what's driving your findings. On the other hand, the green and the blue bars and the pink and the yellow bars, they actually don't appear to recover toward the end. The green and the blue are disability and non-labor force for reasons of home and family responsibilities. And it's just not very clear how these categories contribute to the overall pattern. So it's possible that it's just too noisy to really to say much about it. But it looks like possibly retirement is reclassified to disability, which may happen. I'm just sort of curious if you could dig more into that. Another question would be if you could reconcile these patterns with the demographic heterogeneity in the LFPR pattern. So it makes sense that young people are opting for school and perhaps delaying initial entry into the labor force. And you find that the patterns are driven by young people, but they're also driven by Blacks and less educated individuals and by men. So are men taking on more home family responsibilities? Are Blacks and less educated individuals more likely to go to school? It would be nice if you could, if it's possible, to say something about how your heterogeneity findings sort of support what you're seeing here in these patterns for reasons for non-participation.
So Laura, I'm just going to highlight that we have 5 minutes and they will cut us off at 5. So yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
Okay. Yep. The geography of jobs, and I'm sorry if I get cut off, I'd be happy to send further thoughts, but it's a really ambitious and exciting project. And while it's really still at an early stage, I think the potential is clear for it to be sort of game changing in the way we think about occupations. So let me just, I was going to say some other background, but let me skip to my comments. First, skills versus job titles. So this comment came up in the comments and questions already. How does your approach compare to other ways of classifying jobs, not just OOC, but SOC, but other approaches? I'm curious just about job titles. do they do a fairly good job of classifying skill? And for your case study, I think it might be helpful to show how job titles correspond to each of the skill clusters. So in the BLS manual, you can see, and this is just the manual for your 4 categories, they list illustrative examples of the job titles in each category. And it would be nice to see a similar list of job titles that falls under each of your clusters, if in fact those job titles can be uniquely mapped to clusters. I'm also curious about the classifications, the other classifications that Burning Glass has constructed, since they have their own Burning Glass occupation categories. I'm curious about the reasons for the classification failure beyond those that you already mentioned, the obvious ones, but are there variations across jobs in how well the BLS classification does? And I want to mention that it seems possible that you've chosen sort of an outlier case for your study. And what I mean is that it seems likely that the SOC categories are especially bad at classifying jobs when there's been a lot of technological change and new skill requirements, especially since the last BLS revision. It also seems likely that the SACs are especially bad for classifying high-skill jobs that entail a wider range of skills. But I think this is an empirical question, so it'd be really interesting to see if you're finding, if your patterns hold up when you look at a broader set of occupation groups. And it might be worth trying to analyze the determinants of classification failure in the SOCs. It might also be worth considering what factors could create problems for your skill-based classification. And one that comes to mind is that employers might selectively list the skills that are required if it's a high-skilled job, and there's sort of some prerequisite skills for the skills that are advertised as being required. It's sort of assumed that other skills are also come with those. So I wonder if your analysis, your cluster analysis, is sensitive to assumptions about what other skills sort of come with the skills that are listed. My third comment, I'm wondering, you clearly show that there's substantial geographic variation in the distribution of skill clusters, and you show that there's a difference between the way you classify jobs and the way the BLS does. But I'm really curious how important your classification method is for the geographic distribution of jobs, for understanding that geographic distribution. And I think you sort of ran out of time, but I think you could do more to try to make that link. And so I'm especially when you move forward and look at mobility across commuting zones, like I'd be very curious to see whether similarity in the distribution of skill clusters predicts job flows between commuting zones better than, say, similarity in the distribution of SOCs. I'd also be curious to see whether the analysis you do that showed at the very end looks very qualitatively different if you use SOCs instead of your new categories. And then finally, I have like a second, the determinants of geographic variation. There's a lot potentially to do here. I'd love to talk with you further about it. Is it locations? Is it industry distribution? Or is it perhaps firms, which you might explore by using within firm, in multi-establishment firms, within firm variation in geography, something like that. Okay, I think I'm about to get cut off. So I really enjoyed the paper. And yeah.
Thanks very much.
Awesome, Laura. You did a fantastic job getting in under the wire.